birth of Warhammer 40,000, how the Grimdark future began. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war. But in the creative landscape of 1980s Britain, there was only possibility. This is the complete story of how a small company of passionate, intellectually diverse gamers created what would become one of the most expansive and beloved science fiction universes of all time. Warhammer 40,000's story begins earlier than most fans realize. The very first mention of what would become this iconic universe appeared in April 1983 in a Games Workshop Dragon miniature modeling catalogue. Back then, it was simply called Rogue Trader and was briefly mentioned as a spaceship game without any detailed explanation. At this time, Games Workshop was deeply focused on their successful Warhammer Fantasy Battles game. But they were already envisioning a science fiction counterpart to complement their fantasy line. By October 1983, only months after that first casual mention, Games Workshop's vision had already shifted. In their Compendium 1 catalogue, Rogue Trader was now described as a science fiction role-playing game. For a very brief period, they considered making it Warhammer Fantasy in the future, an idea quickly abandoned. One explanation suggests they felt this would undermine the bleak setting of Warhammer Fantasy if fans believed the world would survive for tens of thousands of years. During this developmental phase, when asked at conventions, GW employees would simply say they were working on their own version of Traveller, a popular sci-fi RPG of the era. What many don't realize is the scholarly background behind Games Workshop at this time. The studio included 3 people with PhDs in archaeology and a professional linguist. This wasn't just a group of gaming enthusiasts. These were deeply educated individuals, well-versed not only in science fiction and pulp literature, but also in classics of world literature. This intellectual foundation explains the rich tapestry of references woven throughout the early Warhammer 40,000 universe, from obvious nods to works like Dune, Foundation, and Starship Troopers, to more subtle literary and historical allusions that rewarded well-read players. The project resurfaced in 1986 in Citadel Journal, where Games Workshop published a cryptic teaser for their upcoming game. Then, in March 1987, they released a series of Imperial Space Marine miniatures. Despite not explicitly connecting these miniatures to either Rogue Trader or Warhammer 40,000, they sold remarkably well. The true architect of the 40K universe was Rick Priestley, though Brian Ansell and Ken Ralston also contributed significantly. Priestley, already involved with Warhammer Fantasy Battle, had a vision to create something entirely new by blending fantasy elements with dark science fiction themes. Priestley would later recall, "We were looking to create a science fiction game that would complement Warhammer Fantasy Battle. The idea was to create something that had the same sense of dark foreboding and cataclysmic war in a universe that was teetering on the brink of destruction." When the game finally launched in 1987, it carried a curious dual title, Rogue Trader, Warhammer 40,000. Why this seemingly awkward naming? Games Workshop had been teasing Rogue Trader for years, so their fan base was already familiar with that name. They added Warhammer for 2 strategic reasons: to distance themselves from another game they had published in 1986 called Rogue Trooper, based on the 2000 AD license, and to leverage their already successful Warhammer brand name to help the new game gain traction. Little did they know, this title would become their most beloved and profitable franchise ever. The first edition already established the core elements we recognize today. A galactic imperium of man, structured as a totalitarian theocracy, worshipping the God Emperor, locked in eternal conflict with various alien races, including space elves and orcs. The original rulebook even opened with a version of the classic introduction that has become synonymous with the setting.
For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and the master of a million worlds by the will of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is carrion lord of the Imperium, to whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed each day, and for whom blood is drunk and flesh is eaten. Human blood and human flesh, the stuff